It's no secret that the genre of analog horror is long past its peak popularity. Fortunately though, that hasn't discouraged people from making their own series and even one-off videos. The trade-off though is that with this content continuing to be churned out, people seem to be of the opinion that quantity is a greater mark of success than quality, which has led us to where we are right now. Instead of being crafted via the characteristics that are known to analog horror, and series being created to have their own unique concepts and looks to them, we keep getting the same content over and over again, which has not been fun as a watcher of the genre. The result is that most of their creations in analog horror just feel like pale imitations of each other, without much to talk about except for how shallow they are. I named this video pretty aggressively, which is part just me being a YouTuber, but I would like to define the term slop since I don't see many people give their definition of that word when they throw it around so errantly. I define slop in this context as content that is easy to quickly create, on account of no effort being put in, and as a result of this lack of effort, it is completely bland and void of anything interesting. Another qualifier I have is that a lot of slop is hard to distinguish. For instance, one slop analog horror is completely the same as another slop. They could very well have been made by the same person due to the lack of any uniqueness. You know how after you eat fast food and you're just hungry like an hour or two later, and for a taste that is completely unremarkable at that? That's how a lot of this analog horror content feels, and I'm here to discuss why that is. As I've discussed before, every topic that gets even a slight bit of buzz is destined to have someone create analog horror out of it. It might even get multiple people making an analog horror out of the same property. You might think it would lead to better quality since competition, blah 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 capitalism, but that's just not the case at all. When I say that people will make an analog horror out of anything that gets attention, I mean anything that gets a bit of attention. For instance, there are so many people who have made an analog horror video out of P. Diddy to the point where it's hard to tell which of these are sincere horror creations and which of these are just trying to capitalize on a meme. If this is a sincere attempt to make horror content out of all the Diddy stuff, then there's a whole conversation to be had about the ethics of using stories of real survivors for a cheap scare. There were actual children that were taken advantage of by Diddy according to all those who spoke out against him, and their experiences are now being thrown into the analog horror slot machine to make videos that are made to be content rather than tasteless art, or even a way to spread awareness about Diddy's antics in the worst possible way. When these people make stuff like Diddy into a cheap video for shock value, it's just lazy and it's disrespectful to anyone who had to suffer from his actions. Analog horror used to have actual creative stories to tell, and now we're just dragging real-life cases of abuse into this format, which is why the genre gets such a bad reputation. At least Urban Spook had the decency to be tasteless about fake stuff. I highly doubt that any of these are made to be scary. My honest belief is that these are just people making memes. Are the memes funny? No, not in the slightest. While this is just one of them, I can assure you that none of them are any better in their humor or their execution. Again, this is just one video, and it's quite short because I can't be bothered to describe a Diddy horror video that's longer than a minute and a half. So we start with an emergency alert that a tall black figure with a BBL is chasing children. He is, of course, holding baby oil, which alludes to all the oil that Diddy was found to have. If he catches kids, then they're gone forever. He's quite dangerous at 8 feet tall, and he reaches speeds of 6 to 7 miles an hour, and he can be shooed away with a job application. As you can see, this video is very obviously a joke, not scary, and the worst offense of it all is that it's not even funny. Unfortunately, this stuff gets a non-negligible amount of views, with the one I just talked about sporting 49k. Most people can only dream of a video getting this kind of view count, and something like that is going to this effortless meme. It seems like someone is just trying to cash in by turning this prolific abuser into a villain with a horror format that is popular. That's really the problem with a genre like this getting so massive when it's simultaneously super easy to recreate. Modern apps allow someone to just put a screen filter and text-to-speech voice on their video, and now it's analog horror. With such a low barrier to entry, it is no wonder that people are just rapidly firing at the wall to see if something slightly sticks. Look for anything that has gained popularity, especially with young people, and you will find an analog horror piece of it, whether it's made as a joke or a genuine attempt to be scary. You think that Diddy reaching speeds of 67 miles an hour was the only time a meme like 6'7" would be referenced in an analog horror? Wrong. The 6'7" kid has himself been made into analog horror videos, turning him into the wildest eldritch abominations. This isn't me pearl clutching about the fact that a kid is being bullied here, but this is getting ridiculous to the point where I think the genre speaks for itself at this point. Of course, these are all memes, but the point of analog horror is to be scary, which might be a daring take on something with horror in the name. The sin with these videos is that they're not even bad analog horror. They're simply put, just not horror. Horror is made to unsettle people, and these videos have the express purpose of not doing that. Even bad horror, you can tell, is trying to scare you. And if we're just memeing, we should have the decency to be funny. These videos are not a meta mic drop on analog horror either. We have videos like the Scrimblow Files by Alex Kister, who created the Mandela Catalog, which properly put all the tendencies of the genre on blast. This was of course inspired by all the criticism that Mandela Catalog and other series like it were subject to. These Diddy horrors aren't even proficient enough to be what Scrimblow Files is making fun of. They're that effortless. I am willing to accept the argument that a lot of the people making these videos are children who don't know what they're doing when they're making all this. This is probably true, but I don't think the fact that a creator is young immediately means that most of this is any good, or that young people just immediately can't make good stuff. We can see actual talent in younger creators like Lizardmen Inc. or Dr. Nowhere, the creators of Obelisk and everything that Dr. Nowhere has made respectively. Now, I'm not saying get good, kids, but if YouTube didn't push these creations when you merely tried to look up the genre, I wouldn't have nearly the problems that I do with them. I do have another point to make regarding the fact that most of the creators of the slop I'm talking about are children. It's not even that these people are in their youth and they struggle in making content that's intriguing. It's that they don't even understand the technical aspects of the genre they're trying to recreate. This section may feel like a nitpick to some, but I get a lot of comments about this, and that's not leaving out my most recent upload about videos that prove that people will make analog horror out of anything. That point is, of course, that so many analog horror videos, in fact, I'm willing to bet a majority of them, are completely devoid of any of the immersive characteristics that contributed to the uncanny feeling that original analog horror creations exuded. These characteristics are, of course, a 4:3 aspect ratio, the look of a VHS, static, tape warping, and a low frame rate. Those are just basic characteristics. There are, of course, more, but those are just the very basics that I find even modern creations struggle with. I won't keep you too long about what exactly makes these characteristics contribute to the unsettling vibe of good analog horror pieces, since everyone and their grandma has talked about that. Essentially, it's a blast from the past, something distant from the current watcher. It can invoke nostalgia or a sense of dread from those who grew up with analog technology, often reminding them of being a kid watching late night programming and then getting hit with an emergency alert or an anti-piracy screen. That would be why so many creators who grew up with that inevitably have some sort of bit in their series that takes the form of a public service announcement. For modern generations, it's a completely foreign medium, so it's something other than the clear and smooth graphics that are all they know, which for them can tap into the uncanny valley. The uncanny valley, in short, is when people feel unease from looking at something familiar, but ever so off that they can tell something's wrong. Observe these images of police renderings of missing people right here, and you can tell something is off about these people. We can also tell that they're unmistakably people, and are at least trying to give off that effect. Of course, what I'm talking about in this video doesn't even hold a candle to the unintentional horror of these missing person renderings. It's not even that tapes or washed out CRT colors look old. It's that they imply that something has been lost in translation, as many fine details are completely unintelligible when observed with analog technology. Degradation in the medium is present, and that's the whole point, which seems to be lost on so many modern creators. Something I need to mention in this context is Textify, a channel which is dedicated to churning out slop after slop. This channel just slaps analog horror in its titles, and nothing like that is ever seen. It's a bunch of Minecraft parkour in the background while shitty AI-generated texts with AI voices read them out. Stuff like this completely ruins the reputation of the genre. It's like they're making text conversations prompted by rough stories they've come up with, like, "Hey ChatGPT, regenerate me some text messages between 3 people fighting off corrupted water sins from the amazing world of Gumball." And the result is this video. This is the epitome of slop, and I wanted to talk about this channel in particular because you can tell that it's kids watching this stuff, attracting them to this content, and as a result, we get the rest of this segment. Look at most recent videos after searching the term analog horror, and I can guarantee you that you'll be hard-pressed to find any videos that aesthetically match the feeling of old analog technology. No, re-uploads of other people's stuff that actually adhere to those standards do not count. In the midst of writing this section in the script of this video, I did my own test, and my hypothesis was true. In fact, most if not all of the videos that showed up were in the shorts format, which in itself is completely antithetical to the aesthetics of analog horror. The reason I say this is that, visual problems with this aside, because I'll go plenty into that, the horror genre was built on series that were slow burners, and told a story that typically had a build-up to a scare or multiple scares. This build-up is completely lost with this format. The dread that someone is meant to feel, even across super new creations like Obelisk, is completely lost and unable to be achieved by the shorts format. Notice I use the term slow burners and not quick burners, because that's what so many of these shorts are. If you're lucky, you'll have to wait 10 seconds before you see anything that's meant to scare you. Most of the time, these shorts are so eager to show their rendition of Bond the Rabbit or False Gabriel that they neglect the storytelling that made their appearances so meaningful. And they skip the building of any dread to cash in on their big bad. Analog horror is meant to linger, while these shorts are designed to do anything but. It's hard to put your slow burn horror video within a scroll of a Subway Surfers video and for it to give the same effect. The shorts format being a vast majority of these uploads is what tips me off to the fact that it is mostly kids uploading these videos. This is a generation of kids who didn't grow up with the technology they're trying to emulate, and as a result, they're failing miserably. Let's talk about Diddy analog horror pieces again, because I think they serve as a good show of how much these kids don't understand the genre. I saw 10 videos about Diddy horror, and of those 10, only 2 of them had the basic static overlay on top of the video to try and give it the analog look. 6 had the decency to format their video in 4:3, but of those 6, only 1 of them had VHS effects that actually gave it the analog look. Only 1, the same one that had the VHS effecting and their video in the right format, had the video doing some tape warping. And finally, only 1 of them had a frame rate that wasn't completely anachronistic. That's another thing, the wild anachronism that is rampant in these videos. If you don't know what that is, it's when things from a mismatching time are present, like when a vast majority of these videos use the default CapCut font text and modern AI voices to try and replicate broadcasts that would have been before either of these things existed. It is a one-way stop to sucking all the immersion out of a video, and it's all too common. You hear the default TikTok voice saying something like,
"I have come for your concrete baby,"
and you're not scared. You've been snapped out of the story and reminded of the fact that you're watching some kid's CapCut edit. It'd be like watching Springtrap play Fortnite and expecting you to stay immersed. Well, actually, FNAF 3 takes place in 2023, so that'd be possible, but you get the point. Another common anachronistic feature of too many analog horror videos is the 60 frames per second frame rate that is default to most editing softwares. 60 FPS is why you might find that some of these videos move in a way far too smooth for it to have been taken on technology that gives us the analog look. Side tangent here, this is also the reason that so many films are shot at 24 FPS. We have all the technology in the world to make movies using 60 FPS, but 60 FPS looks completely unnatural in a film context. Take these two movie scenes for example. The only difference between these two is the frame rate, but one looks like the film you'd see in theaters, and the other looks like something you'd see playing to demo TVs in a Costco. This tangent is to say that 60 FPS looks completely unnatural in a context that is trying to replicate a broadcast, which at the time would have been in 29.97 FPS. This seems like such a banal thing to talk about, but look at this analog horror piece that uses 60 FPS and then take a look at this analog horror piece that doesn't do that. There is such a clear difference here. One looks so much better because it shows that when trying to mimic a lo-fi format, that using a high fidelity frame rate completely undoes any of that immersion that everything else serves to do. This is really what makes it slop to me. The technology is right there, and modern editing software is a thing, but people just don't feel like using it correctly. Many widely acclaimed series like The Mandela Catalog or The Walton Files thrive off of attention to detail, and their fan bases that are able to extract the stories so far, even when they're told through rather obscure means. The suspension of disbelief is necessary to make these stories work, especially with these stories explicitly taking place long in the past. If these pieces were stylized wrong, then it would portray such a lack of care with the details that would make these stories immersive. This would, of course, make people take them less seriously, because after all, who would think that someone who can't even properly recreate the analog aesthetic would actually use it to tell a story well? Not many. Without the basics, these people aren't even making analog horror. They're at best putting VHS filters on TikToks. And what I've said before is just a theoretical thing. I haven't found that any of these lower effort horrors actually have a deeper story that's getting glossed over because of their presentation, but theoretically, if someone had a good story, putting zero effort into their presentation would absolutely make sure that less people go seeking it out. What I'm talking about in this section are basic starters that have nothing to do with even telling a good story, but missing the prerequisites to even be considered analog horror makes this very disheartening for the genre. If creators can't even get the fundamentals correct, then how do you think the story aspects of modern videos are holding up? They're not doing very well. For the other sections, I have admittedly been picking some low-hanging fruit and acting like that's a very impressive thing to do. I've been focusing on technical failings that, by my own standards, make the videos not even fall into this genre. My overall point with that is not that these analog horror videos would all of a sudden be good if they had nailed the technical aspect. In fact, as I'm about to show, nailing the technical aspect is far from all that's needed to make a good horror piece. The last aspect of a lot of analog horror that makes it feel like the genre is heading in the slop direction would be the fact that it's rare that anything feels creative anymore. If an analog horror piece does manage to get all of the aesthetic flourishes correct, then they're at least able to be comfortably called analog horror. Just being analog horror, though, isn't enough to consider it good, though it sadly is a very impressive feat for the genre. It seems as though a lot of analog horror nowadays is just a pale imitation of tropes in popular analog horror videos that actually did something new in the genre. For instance, we have this video based on the Three Little Pigs fairy tale, which is an analog horror rendition of that story. I won't go too deep into what happens in that video because I think we've all heard the story of the Three Little Pigs. It just puts that story in the analog horror format. We can see from the video that it aesthetically fits into the genre based on its looks. It at least has the decency to be low fidelity, unlike too many of its contemporaries. The critique to be had of this piece has everything to do with its presentation beyond the basic parameters. Anyone who has watched the Walton Files before can tell that this is trying to have the same art style and rhythms that Martin Walls was able to achieve when he made his series. The creator is very transparent about their inspiration to make this, but I find that there's a point where a video goes from being inspired to straight up copying. So many newer creations are just derivatives of a few early series that did these tropes effectively. Simply put, there's nothing new being brought to the genre in this video, And I wish that was the case since this video is wildly popular, sporting 5.6 million views. Unfortunately, when I watch this, I'm not scared or sucked into this world at all. I can only think, this person really likes the Walton Files. If they put their own spin on the format or on the scares, then I wouldn't be so disappointed with this video. This creator has the technical ability to make something great, which already puts them in the upper echelon of analog horror creators, but they use it to imitate someone else instead of making something original. I do really need to commend this creator for not just making a PSA type video though. Watching Slop for so long did make this admittedly a refreshing watch. I'm not saying that everything that everyone makes needs to be genre defining, but some stuff is just too shameless to brush aside. This is the first time you'll hear me praising Urban Spook on this channel for his series as a whole, but at least with Urban Spook, he had a story planned out from the start, and that's becoming more obvious as episodes come out, and he has a unique style that he puts into his music and art. Discussion about the story itself aside, Modern Creations make Urban Spook, a series that I've criticized harshly in the past, stand out as an experimental and avant-garde piece. It may be edged with no purpose, but I'd rather watch him expand on a story he's clearly put more work into than any of these new videos that have cheap scares and copies of the Mandela catalog. I poked fun at a trope throughout this video, and now it's time to put it on full blast. And that is a dull PSA format that 90% of the videos that can even be called analog horror fall into. Take a look at these 4 videos. These are all some of the most popular analog horror videos on the platform, sporting views in the 7 figures. Intuitively, you can probably tell they're all made by separate people judging by the framing of this video, but there's really nothing here to distinguish these videos from a visual standpoint. They come in the form of a black screen and minimalistic visuals and a text-to-speech voice reading out the text on the video. Some pull off the VHS effect better than others, but that doesn't change this fact. None of the videos escape this scene. These videos make an attempt to cash in on the unsettling nature of a late-night emergency announcement, but they never leave that announcement, and only leave us with the concept that something could be scary. The public service announcement format can work, but it has to be in the service of a broader narrative, while these videos are under the impression that just a PSA is a story in itself. Other series have done the informational program format well, like Vita Carnis or The Boiled One. I have my criticisms of those videos, but they at least succeed in doing what all the other pieces fail at, which is telling a story that doesn't feel too dependent on someone else's style. Something can be far from the best without being slop, of course. The problem isn't that analog horror is incapable of being creative. The problem here is that I see a lot of potential in the technical abilities of creators that feel like putting in that effort, but so many of them feel like making the same video over and over again. Things like PSAs and weird distorted figures that are not horror in themselves when they're devoid of context that gives them meaning. Until creators get better at putting the methods into action, it seems like the genre is doomed to be in a loop of continual self-parody. I can't see this happening though, as again, what I've shown as examples of slop get a lot of views, and so if these formats are allowing them to rack up popularity, then they have no reason to stop. This is of course because audiences' standards have weakened to the point where stuff like Pac-Man analog horror can rack up millions of views and earn thousands of dollars, and trust me, I'm a YouTuber, I know this person made bank off of this video. It's discouraging as someone who finds the genre intriguing. Seeing people turn it into a mechanism for printing money rather than making art has made it a far cry from what it used to be. There is, however, an upside to all this, which is that there are, albeit increasingly rare, creators who still decide to take risks and break from the mold that all these slop channels have been forcing. When someone decides they want to tell their story with their own spin and use unconventional methods or overall seem dedicated to creating their own style, I can feel it right away, and it reminds me of what intrigued me about the genre to begin with. I really mean no hatred to people like Foxymations, because for as derivative as their creations can be, I can at least appreciate the effort that goes into making an analog horror video that goes beyond the black screen white text format. Even if something isn't groundbreaking, I can at least acknowledge when someone puts in effort. Since I've been such a downer for most of this video, I want to talk about things I like instead of shitting on actual creators, and I can't finish that sentence or I'll be smited by YouTube. I would like to briefly talk about a few series that I've watched that have caught my eye that were made or are series that started in the last 2 years. The first one is Obelisk by Lizardmen Inc. Funnily enough, I actually found Lizardmen Inc. because of his skibbity analog horror that he made, when I and a couple of friends were looking for some brain-rot analog horror to laugh at. That video caught my eye. We went to his channel to see if he had other things of that nature, but instead we found an earnest attempt at creating a series. His series Obelisk was a very refreshing watch after about 10 Tung 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 Sahur analog horror videos. What makes this stick out, though, is that the series isn't exclusively analog horror. It uses bits that mimic point-and-click gameplay in tandem with tapes to tell its story. The story is still relatively obscure, and it seems to be one of those evil cryptid stories, but honestly even that label is questionable and a little dishonest. The creature's motivations for taking a character's child are unknown. A fact of interest is that these cryptids can't recognize things in different phases of their life, which this fact immediately gives this more nuance and obscurity than most other things in its time. It shows a level of cognitive dysfunction that's uncharacteristic of so many modern analog horror villains that feel like insta-death machines rather than actual characters to fear. In a pretty popular scene of the series, one of them doesn't recognize a child whose house it lived in when that child has grown older, saying, "What are you? I know your face," when seeing them again. That single line gives more depth to these creatures than I've come to expect as of late. I can't wait for the motivations and full scope of this story to be realized as it unfolds. So many aspects are still unknown, but that ambiguity is very obviously intentional and left for later installments, and I'm always down for a slow burner. In fact, slow burners are what I find to be the most impressive and effective in this genre. Obelisk isn't unique in sticking out among the sea of slop. I'll be talking about a couple other examples. The next one I want to highlight is The Ningen by Manticore. Most people know her for the Monument mythos, but her lesser-known project, The Ningen, deserves just as much recognition. This series takes the form of a documentary/educational program on a creature known as the Ningen. Translated from Japanese, Ningen means human, but in this context the word is used in a much more sinister way than just plainly calling something human. I don't want to spoil too much of this series because I genuinely recommend you check this one out. Combined, it only runs a total of 30 minutes. The series uses a combination of footage from expeditions, infographics, and talks from people who have had personal connections to this fictional creature. The concept of the corrupted, uncanny human that is an affront to God has been done so many times before, which made me go into this with doubts, but by the second episode, I felt it had done this trope well enough to justify using it. The series makes constant use of the fact that many nationalities were on this expedition that found the Ningen, using English as the language that tells us the plain story. However, hidden messages are spread out throughout the series. The bilingual program in English and Japanese gives hints to the Ningen's actual intents, using the Japanese text that, on a first viewing, one would assume were just to translate the English. At the end of episode 2, there's a message in Russian that is supposedly mistranslated. Different definitions for the same word in English can branch into different words when translated into different languages, so people were thinking this creator was a victim of Google Translate. Instead, the fact that this message was incorrect was a major teller about revelations about the characters, and what they would learn about themselves and what happened on that voyage where the Ningen was encountered. This is what makes the Ningen so special to me. It doesn't just hit you with creepy imagery and call it a day. The imagery is actually quite unsettling at times, which itself is unique, but what grips me the most is the storytelling via its structure, its use of subtle linguistic distinctions, and the documentary format that might make someone assume there's less than what's actually going on. The fact that Manticore took what looked like a translation error and made it into a key plot device is some very impressive attention to detail, and it's stuff like that that keeps the genre alive. I won't keep you too long in my gushing about stuff I like. I'll give a list of series that I've found pretty neat even if they aren't perfect in their executions. I suggest Alta Paradisus for its story that does more with the possessed person gimmick than just, they're just there, okay? The latest episode of Urban Spook, episode 9, was also pretty decent. It still had the typical edgefest, but the story really develops and the series starts to escape that black screen, white text combo that it mostly stuck to for the rest of its run. Everything Dr. Nowhere puts out also has some unsettling imagery, so check him out too, even if the story writing could suffer from some pitfalls here and there. The two series to start with I talked about in more than a few sentences because I felt like they deserved as much attention than any individual instance of slop I talked about. I'm of course not done with talking about things that I've liked. I also suggest checking out White Stag Education. White Stag Education has put so much effort into its production, and like Spaceman Scott said in his video going over the piece, you can tell all the creators were having so much fun when they made this. Just the charm that this series has alone kept me watching. This one has ended, even if at a point where they could have kept going. Clocking it at only 40 minutes, it's still one of the series that even some big names on YouTube consider to be proof that good content is still possible nowadays. I wanted to end this video off talking about things I enjoy because it's super easy to talk about things that are bad and pretend like everything is over and doomer about that even when that's very much not the case. I think the genre is far from dead in spite of its slop problem, and the creators that decide that they want to put themselves ahead of the slop always earn my respect. Even if what they end up making is far from perfect, I can take a step back and see people with an intent to tell a story, and as I've stressed multiple times, that really sticks out among a sea of people that just want to make content rather than making art. I've been John X Woodcat, and I'll see you in the next video.